45 small, reckless choices that seemed insignificant at the time completely altered history. Each decision, made in a moment of folly, set off a chain reaction with catastrophic consequences. These weren't just mistakes, they were turning points that reshaped the world in ways no one could have predicted. Nations were changed, lives were shattered, and the future was forever altered. Today, we're looking at 45 of these game-changing missteps. The aftermath of these decisions will shock you. Chapter 1. The Assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. In June 1914, a single, seemingly insignificant decision would spiral into one of the deadliest conflicts in history. A Serbian nationalist, by chance, changed his route that day, crossing paths with Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo. A shot rang out, and history was forever altered. The assassination wasn't just the killing of one man, it was the spark that ignited World War I. The world stood on the brink, and one act of violence sent nations into a frenzy. Alliances were triggered, and within weeks the entire globe would be plunged into chaos. What started as a personal vendetta turned into a war that would decimate entire empires and change the map of the world. But this was just the beginning. Chapter 2. The Fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. The Berlin Wall, a symbol of division for nearly 30 years, stood strong. But then, during a routine press conference, a simple slip of the tongue by an East German official changed everything. "East Germans can now cross the border," he casually announced, not realizing the chaos that would follow. What was meant to be a minor policy clarification exploded into a mass rush of East Germans flooding across the border. Within hours, the wall crumbled, and with it, the Cold War began to unravel. What started as one careless mistake, the wrong words at the wrong time, brought an entire regime to its knees, changed the political landscape of Europe, and accelerated the end of Soviet power. The world was no longer divided, and that was just the first crack in the system. Chapter 3. The Failure to Prepare for the Pearl Harbor Attack, December 7, 1941, an ordinary Sunday morning, or so it seemed. But what was about to unfold was far from ordinary. Despite numerous intelligence reports warning of an impending Japanese attack, the U.S. Navy underestimated the threat. A series of small oversights, ignored warnings, miscommunications, and a false sense of security allowed Japan to strike at Pearl Harbor with devastating force. The result? Nearly 3,500 lives lost in a matter of hours, a crippled Pacific Fleet, and the United States thrust into World War II. What had been an ordinary day exploded into chaos, and the nation's vulnerability was laid bare for the world to see. A single failure in preparation sparked a global conflict that would change everything, but what they didn't know was the war was just beginning. Chapter 4. The Invention of the Atomic Bomb in 1938, a small discovery in a laboratory set the stage for a world-altering catastrophe. Nuclear fission, a breakthrough in physics, would soon give birth to a weapon so powerful it could obliterate entire cities. What started as a scientific curiosity quickly spiraled into the development of the atomic bomb. Scientists worked tirelessly, unknowingly building a device capable of wiping out generations in an instant. When the bomb was dropped on Hiroshima in 1945, the world was shaken to its core. A single moment of scientific brilliance turned into an unimaginable disaster, forever altering the course of history. The nuclear age had begun, and the terrifying reality of global annihilation was now a constant fear. The consequences of this discovery would echo through every corner of the globe, and the world would never feel safe again. Chapter 5. The Titanic's speed in iceberg-laden waters, April 10, 1912, aboard the unsinkable Titanic. The voyage seemed perfect. But as warnings of icebergs flooded in, Captain Edward Smith made a fateful decision: keep the ship at full speed. What seemed like a minor choice would lead to one of the greatest disasters in maritime history. Hours later, the Titanic collided with an iceberg, tearing open its hull. In moments, the unsinkable ship was sinking, dragging over 1,500 lives down with it. What started as a confident cruise quickly turned into a nightmare of panic and chaos. The world watched in horror as the luxury liner, thought to be impervious to disaster, met its doom. But the real horror came after the sinking. The world was about to learn how fragile safety truly was. Chapter 6. The invention of the personal computer in 1975. A small team at Altair had no idea they were about to change the world forever. Their creation, a personal computer kit, was originally meant for hobbyists, but what started as a niche project quickly ignited a revolution. The personal computer transformed from a simple idea to the cornerstone of the digital age. Silicon Valley was born. This single decision to make computing accessible to everyone would reshape every industry, from business to education to entertainment. What was once the realm of large corporations and governments became personal, portable, and powerful. The world suddenly found itself in the digital age, where information was at everyone's fingertips. But the ripple effect didn't stop there. The way we live, work, and communicate was about to be flipped upside down. Chapter 7. The missed opportunity to stop the Black Plague. In 1347, a fleet of ships carrying rats and fleas docked at European ports. Authorities ignored the early warnings. No quarantine was enforced. What followed was the Black Plague, one of the deadliest pandemics in history. The disease spread like wildfire, killing nearly a third of Europe's population. This simple oversight, allowing infected ships to dock, caused an unimaginable catastrophe. It wiped out entire communities, leaving cities in ruins. The world had never seen such destruction, and the aftermath would be felt for generations. A single misstep in managing a quarantine led to a global nightmare. What they didn't know was the world would never be the same again. Chapter 8. The launch of the Space Shuttle Challenger. January 28, 1986. NASA made the decision to proceed with the launch of the Challenger shuttle, despite warnings about the freezing temperatures and risks to the O-rings. That fateful choice became one of the most devastating moments in American space exploration. The shuttle exploded just 73 seconds after launch, killing all 7 astronauts aboard. It was a national tragedy that sent shockwaves through the space program. A single decision to ignore the warnings turned into a nightmare for the families, NASA, and the entire nation. But the aftermath wasn't over. The future of space exploration was now in jeopardy. Chapter 9. The discovery of the New World by Columbus. In 1492, Christopher Columbus set sail, convinced that sailing west would lead him to Asia. Instead, he stumbled upon the Americas. What was meant to be a shortcut to trade riches became one of history's greatest accidents. Columbus' voyage sparked an age of colonization that would forever alter the course of entire continents. Indigenous populations were decimated, new worlds were claimed, and history was rewritten. The unintended discovery of a new world set in motion centuries of exploitation and cultural upheaval. What began as a simple navigation error changed everything. But Columbus didn't realize what he had found would change history forever. Chapter 10. The decision to create the nuclear arms race. In 1949, the Soviet Union tested its first atomic bomb. What began as a single move in the Cold War spiraled into an unprecedented nuclear arms race. The United States, shaken by the Soviets' leap in weaponry, rushed to develop even more powerful weapons. This decision led to decades of fear, espionage, and the threat of global annihilation. What started as a reaction to one test quickly escalated into a terrifying arms race that could have destroyed the world. Nations built arsenals that were capable of wiping out civilization, all because of one decision in a distant lab. And this wasn't just about weapons. It was a war of nerves that would last for decades. Chapter 11. The overlooked warning about the Chernobyl disaster. In 1986, At the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, a seemingly routine safety test turned into a nightmare. Engineers, in their rush to conduct the test, ignored crucial safety protocols and warnings from their colleagues. But it wasn't just one mistake, it was a series of overlooked flaws. The reactor was unstable, and the test, intended to simulate a power outage, went horribly wrong. A catastrophic explosion sent radioactive clouds drifting across Europe. The consequences were immediate, devastating, and far-reaching. The explosion killed 30 people on the spot, but the radiation spread, poisoning thousands more, displacing entire towns and creating a wasteland. The decision to rush through the test and ignore warnings led to the greatest nuclear disaster in history. The real horror wasn't just the explosion, it was the aftermath, the hidden costs of the radiation that would linger for decades, and what was meant to be a small test became a global catastrophe. Chapter 12. The failure to stop the Great Fire of London in 1666. A small fire started in a bakery on Pudding Lane. It was a common, everyday event, except this time, the decision not to act immediately would lead to a disaster. Instead of using water to douse the flames, the fire spread uncontrollably through London's densely packed wooden structures. The city was unprepared for a fire of this scale. What started as a manageable fire quickly grew into a raging inferno, destroying over 87 churches, 13,000 homes, and much of the city. The Great Fire of London, fueled by carelessness and poor decision-making, reshaped the city forever. This disaster didn't just burn down buildings, it destroyed the way of life in the city. The decision to let the fire grow unchecked led to profound changes in urban planning, building codes, and fire safety that would affect the world for centuries. What started as a small mistake became an all-consuming force that would change the city's landscape and history forever. Chapter 13. The miscommunication that led to the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003. The United States made a decision that would ignite one of the most controversial wars in history. It all started with flawed intelligence miscommunications, errors in judgment, and a rush to act. The U.S. government, convinced that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, launched an invasion. What followed was a disaster. Thousands of lives were lost, millions were displaced, and the region was thrown into chaos. The decision was based on faulty information, on the assumption that Iraq posed an immediate threat. What should have been a diplomatic process turned into a costly and bloody conflict that lasted for years. But it wasn't just the U.S. that was impacted, the entire Middle East was thrown into instability. The war led to the rise of terrorist groups like ISIS and reshaped the geopolitical landscape forever. A decision, driven by fear and faulty intelligence, led to catastrophic consequences. Chapter 14. The air raid that changed history. Hiroshima, on August 6, 1945, the United States dropped the first ever atomic bomb on Hiroshima, Japan. The decision was swift, the consequences immediate. A single bomb obliterated an entire city, killing over 100,000 people. What was meant to bring an end to World War II marked the dawn of the nuclear age, and the horrifying reality of weapons of mass destruction became painfully clear. What started as a military decision to end a war quickly spiraled into a moral and ethical nightmare. But the aftermath wasn't just the devastation of Hiroshima, it was the beginning of a terrifying new era. The very existence of the human race was now on the line. A single, devastating decision shifted the balance of power, leading to the Cold War and a race to develop even more powerful weapons. The question wasn't just whether the war would end, it was whether humanity could survive the consequences of its own creation. What had seemed like an end was only the beginning of something far more terrifying. Chapter 15. The invention of the Internet in the 1960s, a series of small decisions by scientists and engineers, led to the creation of ARPANET, the precursor to the Internet. What was originally intended as a tool for military communication grew into something far more revolutionary. The Internet, born from humble beginnings, became the backbone of the modern world. What started as a research project would soon connect billions of people globally, allowing for instant communication, commerce, and the sharing of information on an unimaginable scale. But the real impact wasn't just how it transformed daily life, it was the unforeseen consequences. The Internet would give rise to social media, online commerce, and an entirely new digital economy. It would change how people interact, how information spreads, and how we see the world. The Internet wasn't just a tool, it became the infrastructure of modern society. And all of this, from e-commerce to social revolutions, started with a decision to connect computers. What seemed like a small leap transformed the world. Chapter 16. The Sinking of the Lusitania. On May 7, 1915, the RMS Lusitania, a British passenger ship, was struck by a German U-boat torpedo off the coast of Ireland. Despite being warned about the risk of German submarine attacks, the Lusitania sailed without proper precautions. The decision to continue the voyage, despite the imminent danger, sealed its fate. Within 18 minutes, the ship sank, taking 1,198 lives with it. The tragedy sent shockwaves through the world, rallying public opinion in favor of entering World War I. But this wasn't just about the loss of lives, it was a turning point. The sinking of the Lusitania provided the final push for the United States to enter the war, shifting the balance of power in favor of the Allies. What seemed like a routine transatlantic voyage led to a monumental shift in the war's trajectory and the future of international diplomacy. Chapter 17. The Decision to Ignore the Dangers of Smoking. In the 20th century, millions of lives were lost to smoking, yet for decades, the dangers were ignored. Cigarette companies marketed their products as glamorous and harmless, with no regard for the health risks. Doctors even recommended cigarettes to their patients. When evidence about the link between smoking and cancer surfaced, it was suppressed by powerful interests. What seemed like an innocent habit quickly turned into a global health crisis. The stakes weren't just individual lives, they were entire generations. The decision to ignore the mounting evidence not only fueled an epidemic, but also placed a massive burden on healthcare systems worldwide. By the time the truth came to light, millions had already died from smoking-related diseases, and the effects would be felt for decades. Chapter 18. The Economic Collapse Triggered by the 1929 Stock Market Crash. In 1929, the stock market was booming and confidence was high, but a series of bad decisions, reckless speculation, over-leveraging, and the refusal to regulate the market led to disaster. On October 29th, Black Tuesday, the stock market crashed. Billions in wealth vanished, wiping out millions of investors. The economic fallout triggered the Great Depression, which crippled the global economy for years. Unemployment soared, and poverty spread. What started as a few bad decisions turned into the most devastating economic collapse of the 20th century. The consequences went beyond money. They destroyed livelihoods, shattered families, and forever changed the financial landscape. The ripple effects of that one mistake reached far beyond Wall Street. Chapter 19. The Lost Opportunity to End Slavery in the U.S. Early in the early 1800s, the U.S. was on the verge of abolishing slavery, yet key political decisions failed to secure its end. Had leaders pushed harder, or had there been a unified front, slavery might have been abolished before it became entrenched. Instead, political compromises delayed the inevitable. The decision to ignore human rights for political gain led to decades of suffering as slavery deepened and the nation's moral fabric was torn. The cost was staggering. It wasn't just the loss of lives or the stain on a nation's conscience, it was a civil war, a massive loss of life, and a fight for equality that would stretch well into the 20th century. what could have been a peaceful resolution turned into one of the bloodiest wars in American history. Chapter 20. The decision to underestimate the German threat before World War II in the 1930s. As Adolf Hitler rose to power, Western leaders failed to take his warnings seriously. The decision to dismiss the early signs of Nazi aggression, ignoring blatant rearmament and the invasion of neighboring countries, left Europe vulnerable. The policy of appeasement, aimed at avoiding war, emboldened Hitler to continue his expansion, leading directly to World War II. What seemed like diplomatic attempts to avoid conflict ended up unleashing the deadliest war in history. The result wasn't just the death toll, it was the destruction of entire civilizations, the collapse of empires, and the reshaping of global politics. The decision to appease Hitler was a mistake that cost millions of lives, forever altering the course of history. Chapter 21. The assassination of John F. Kennedy on November 22, 1963, a single gunshot echoed through Dealey Plaza, cutting short the life of President John F. Kennedy. The decision to let him travel in an open motorcade through a city filled with political tensions proved to be a fatal mistake. What should have been a routine event became a national tragedy, sending shockwaves through the world. The loss of Kennedy wasn't just a political blow, it shattered the hope and optimism of a generation. The assassination marked the beginning of an era of political instability and distrust. But what they didn't realize was that Kennedy's death would lead to profound changes in the U.S. government, setting the stage for years of conflict and division. This moment altered the trajectory of American history and its place in the world. Chapter 22. The failure to prevent the Bhopal gas disaster in 1984, a deadly gas leak at a Union Carbide plant in Bhopal, India, killed thousands and injured hundreds of thousands more. A series of poor decisions ignored safety measures, inadequate training, and poor maintenance led to one of the worst industrial disasters in history. The plant's failure to heed warnings and address safety concerns caused catastrophic damage. What started as a minor oversight escalated into a deadly tragedy, leaving families devastated and a city permanently scarred. This disaster didn't just affect Bhopal, it sparked global debates about industrial safety and corporate responsibility. The failure to act became a blueprint for future environmental and human rights activism. The world would never look at industrial hazards the same way again. Chapter 23. The Fall of the Roman Empire. A series of bad decisions by the 5th century. The Roman Empire was a shadow of its former self. The empire's downfall didn't come from one battle or one emperor's decision, it came from a series of small, costly missteps. From the overexpansion of the empire to the corruption of political leaders, every decision chipped away at Rome's power. The empire's inability to adapt, to listen to those who warned of its collapse, set the stage for its inevitable fall. Rome's collapse didn't just end an empire, it marked the end of an era. The power vacuum left by Rome's fall led to centuries of chaos in Europe, and the repercussions of this negligence would last for centuries. Chapter 24. The decision to withdraw from Vietnam in 1973. The United States made the decision to pull out of Vietnam. What seemed like a decision to end a losing war became a turning point in American history. The decision to withdraw without a clear victory left the South Vietnamese government vulnerable. As predicted, the country fell to the communist forces in 1975, and millions of lives were lost. The decision to exit the war prematurely led to a global perception of American weakness. But the impact was far from over. The war's aftermath altered U.S. foreign policy and military strategy for decades. What had seemed like a political move to avoid further loss of life set the stage for greater instability in Southeast Asia and an intense national reckoning. Chapter 25. The Reign of Terror. During the French Revolution promised liberty, equality, and fraternity. But in 1793, the decision to plunge the nation into the Reign of Terror turned those ideals into a nightmare. Under Robespierre's leadership, revolutionary justice became a bloodbath. Thousands were executed in the name of protecting the revolution. What started as an effort to secure liberty became a frenzy of paranoia and violence. The very people who fought for freedom were now its victims. The stakes were high. What seemed like a necessary purge to protect the revolution led to a period of chaos that shattered the ideals it sought to protect. France was left in ruins, and the revolution would lead to even greater instability, setting the stage for Napoleon's rise to power. Chapter 26: The decision to bomb Dresden in World War II in February 1945. As World War II neared its end, Allied forces made a decision that would haunt them forever. The city of Dresden, home to thousands of civilians, was deemed a strategic target. In a brutal air raid, British and American bombers unleashed a hailstorm of bombs on the historic city, killing an estimated 25,000 people. The destruction was complete. Entire blocks were flattened, and the city was left in ruins. What was intended to break German morale ended up being one of the most controversial bombings of the war. The stakes were high, the end of the war was near, but this single decision created a firestorm of moral and ethical debates. The devastation of Dresden raised questions about the limits of wartime conduct and whether civilians should be considered legitimate targets. What seemed like a necessary strike to accelerate the end of the war left a scar on the Allies' conscience that would persist long after peace was restored. The impact of that single decision reached far beyond the rubble of Dresden. Chapter 27: The failed assassination attempt on Adolf Hitler in 1944. A group of German officers, disgusted by Adolf Hitler's policies, tried to assassinate him. The plot, known as Operation Valkyrie, was meticulously planned. A bomb was placed in a conference room where Hitler was scheduled to attend, but the bomb failed to kill him, and a series of miscommunications allowed Hitler to survive. The officers believed they had succeeded, but Hitler's escape led to a brutal crackdown. Hundreds of conspirators were executed, and the resistance against Hitler was crushed. Had the assassination succeeded, the entire course of history could have changed. The war may have ended sooner, saving millions of lives, but instead, the decision to act against Hitler came too late. His survival ensured the war continued for another year, leading to even more destruction. The failure of Operation Valkyrie wasn't just a missed opportunity, it prolonged the suffering of Europe and altered the fate of an entire generation. One bomb, one moment, could have rewritten history. Chapter 28: The overconfidence that led to the Spanish Armada's defeat in 1588. King Philip II of Spain launched the Spanish Armada, an attempt to invade England and overthrow Queen Elizabeth I. The decision to assemble such a large fleet seemed like an unstoppable force, but overconfidence led to disaster. The Spanish Armada, despite its size and strength, was no match for the smaller, more maneuverable English fleet. Bad weather and strategic errors played their part, but it was the underestimation of England's naval power that sealed Spain's fate. The defeat of the Armada was a turning point in European history. Spain's naval dominance was shattered, and England's rise as a global maritime power was secured. The decision to wage an all-out invasion of England, driven by overconfidence and the belief in Spanish superiority, backfired spectacularly. The consequences were far-reaching. Spain's empire began to decline, while England, emboldened by the victory, would soon embark on its own imperial expansion. What seemed like a glorious conquest turned into Spain's most humiliating defeat. Chapter 29: The decision to launch the Crusades. In 1095, Pope Urban II called for the First Crusade, urging Christians to reclaim the Holy Land from Muslim control. What began as a religious mission quickly spiraled into a centuries-long conflict with devastating consequences. The decision to embark on the Crusades was driven by religious zeal and the promise of glory. Yet, the Crusaders' brutality, pillaging, and massacres tarnished the original religious ideals. The Crusades not only devastated the Middle East, but also led to centuries of tension between the Christian and Muslim worlds. The stakes were enormous. What was supposed to be a righteous campaign became a source of enduring hatred. The Crusades forever altered the geopolitical landscape, leading to conflicts that persist today. The decision to launch the Crusades was an exercise in blind faith, with little regard for the far-reaching consequences. What could have been a religious pilgrimage turned into a bloody, divisive series of wars that reshaped the world's history. The ripple effects of that decision are still felt across the world. Chapter 30. The Development of the Slave Trade. The transatlantic slave trade, a horrific chapter in human history, began with a simple economic decision: the need for cheap labor to fuel the growing demand for sugar, tobacco, and cotton. European traders began forcibly transporting Africans to the Americas, where they were exploited in brutal conditions. What started as an economic enterprise grew into one of the most dehumanizing practices ever conceived. Entire generations of Africans were torn from their homeland, their lives reduced to property and forced labor. The consequences were catastrophic. Millions of Africans were subjected to inhumane treatment, and the social, economic, and cultural fabric of entire regions was forever shattered. What was initially a decision driven by greed became a legacy of suffering, oppression, and inequality that would last for centuries. The impact of the slave trade is still felt today, as its repercussions echo through modern racial tensions and inequality. A decision that seemed to serve economic interests led to a dark legacy that humanity is still grappling with. Chapter 31. The Economic Impact of the Gold Standard Abandonment. In 1971, President Richard Nixon made the pivotal decision to end the United States' reliance on the gold standard. Until then, the U.S. dollar had been tied directly to gold, providing global stability. Nixon's decision to move away from this system, making the dollar a fiat currency, was initially intended to combat inflation and fix a broken economy. But this seemingly necessary choice triggered a cascade of global economic changes. The effects were far-reaching. By removing the dollar's gold backing, the U.S. essentially removed a cornerstone of international trust. The decision led to currency fluctuations, rising global debt, and, eventually, the rise of free-floating exchange rates. While it provided short-term relief, it also set the stage for volatile global financial systems and exacerbated inequality. What began as a solution to one problem created a host of others, changing the global financial landscape forever. Chapter 32. The Ignorance of Early Warning Signs. Before the 2008 financial crisis in 2008, the world teetered on the brink of financial collapse. The global economy was built on the assumption that housing prices would keep rising. Financial institutions, banks, and governments ignored the mounting signs of a housing bubble. Subprime mortgages, risky investments, and lax regulations created an unstable economic foundation. Then came the crash. What started as a series of overlooked red flags in the housing market quickly spiraled into the worst financial crisis since the Great Depression. Billions of dollars were lost, global markets plummeted, and millions lost their homes and livelihoods. The decisions to overlook warnings, combined with reckless financial practices, sent shockwaves through the global economy. What was supposed to be a booming economy became a nightmare that would take years to recover from. Chapter 33. The Decision to Overlook Dangers of Nuclear Power. Fukushima. In 2011, a massive earthquake and tsunami hit Japan, triggering the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear disaster. But the disaster wasn't just caused by nature, it was the result of decades of poor planning, regulatory failure, and an overconfidence in nuclear safety. Despite warnings and the vulnerability of the plant's design, the decision was made to operate without sufficient safeguards. When the tsunami struck, it overwhelmed the plant's defenses. Reactors failed, releasing radioactive materials into the environment. The consequences were dire. Thousands of people were displaced, and the environmental damage was widespread. What started as a routine operation turned into a global crisis, forever altering the perception of nuclear energy. The Fukushima disaster didn't just damage the plant, it cast doubt on the entire nuclear power industry, making it clear that one bad decision can lead to catastrophic consequences. Chapter 34. The declaration of war on France by Prussia in 1870. In 1870, tensions between Prussia and France were high. The decision by Prussian Chancellor Otto von Bismarck to provoke France into declaring war set off a chain of events that would ultimately lead to the unification of Germany. Bismarck's clever manipulation of diplomatic incidents such as the EMS dispatched to a French declaration of war, but the results were far more devastating than anticipated. What seemed like a tactical move for Prussia ended with the humiliation of France and the rise of a united Germany as a dominant European power. The war itself was quick and decisive, but its long-term effects reshaped the European balance of power, leading directly to the conditions that would later spark World War I. Bismarck's gamble, which appeared to secure his country's position, sowed the seeds for future conflict on a much larger scale. Chapter 35. The American Civil Wars start over a single shot in 1861. The first shot, fired at Fort Sumter, ignited the American Civil War. But the war didn't begin because of a single battle. It began because of decades of tension over slavery, state rights, and national identity. That single shot was the culmination of years of bad decisions, such as the failed compromises that attempted to placate the South, which only delayed the inevitable. The war that followed was brutal, claiming over 600,000 lives, but it changed America forever. Slavery was abolished, and the nation's unity was tested and solidified. What seemed like a small incident-tone shot became the spark for a war that redefined the United States. The ramifications were enormous. The Civil War reshaped the country's political, economic, and social fabric. What seemed like an isolated conflict exploded into a battle for the nation's soul. Chapter 36. The decision to overlook the dangers of nuclear power. Fukushima. In 2011, the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant disaster became a symbol of the dangers of underestimating risk. The Japanese government and Tokyo Electric Power Company, TEPCO, had been warned for years about the plant's vulnerability to natural disasters, but these warnings were ignored. Despite Japan being one of the most earthquake-prone nations, the plant's design failed to meet the necessary safety standards. When the magnitude 9 earthquake struck, followed by a tsunami, the plant's reactors were overwhelmed, causing explosions and the release of radioactive materials. The catastrophic consequences of this oversight were immediate. Thousands of people were evacuated, entire towns were left uninhabitable, and global trust in nuclear energy plummeted. The world watched in horror as a combination of poor decisions and complacency triggered a disaster that affected the lives of countless people and contaminated the environment for decades. The Fukushima disaster didn't just damage a single plant, it reshaped nuclear policy worldwide, intensifying the debate on energy sources. What was supposed to be a safe, clean power solution turned into a nightmare, with the repercussions still unfolding today. Chapter 37. The Emancipation Proclamation. After delay in 1863, President Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring all slaves in Confederate states to be free. But this landmark decision came too late to prevent the devastating effects of slavery in the United States. For decades, lawmakers had failed to take decisive action on the issue, delaying emancipation and prolonging the suffering of millions. Lincoln's delayed action came at a steep price. The country was already in the middle of a brutal civil war, and it was the war, not legislation, that finally pushed the abolition of slavery to the forefront. The proclamation marked a turning point in the war, but by then, so much pain had already been inflicted, with generations of people enslaved, their lives shaped by unimaginable cruelty. What should have been a moral decision earlier in the country's history was delayed by political hesitation, costing lives and fracturing the nation. The Emancipation Proclamation, while vital, only came as the war was raging. The cost of inaction during those early years was too high to undo. This delay affected every aspect of American society. Chapter 38: The Failure to Listen to Galileo's Findings About the Earth. In 1610, Galileo Galilei made an extraordinary discovery. The Earth was not the center of the universe. His observations through a telescope showed that the Earth revolved around the Sunna truth that contradicted centuries of church doctrine. However, instead of embracing Galileo's groundbreaking findings, the Catholic Church condemned them, branding him a heretic. Galileo was forced to recant, and his theories were suppressed for years. The decision to ignore or silence scientific evidence was catastrophic for the advancement of knowledge. It wasn't just that Galileo's findings were rejected, it was the suppression of science itself, setting back the progress of human understanding. For centuries, this decision left humanity in the dark about the true nature of our solar system, stifling progress in astronomy, physics, and even philosophy. The stakes were immense. The world was denied the full potential of scientific discovery for generations. What could have been a new era of enlightenment became one of ignorance and dogma. The decision to ignore Galileo's findings wasn't just a minor oversight, it was a world-changing mistake that delayed the Renaissance's influence on science and progress. Chapter 39: The disastrous decision to engage in the Battle of the Somme in 1916. During World War I, the Battle of the Somme became one of the most tragic and costly military blunders in history. British and French forces launched a major offensive against the German army, hoping to break the stalemate on the Western Front. But the decision to launch the attack, without fully understanding the strength of the German defenses, coupled with poor tactical planning, led to an unimaginable loss of life. In one day alone, over 57,000 British soldiers were killed or wounded. The battle lasted for months, resulting in more than 1 million casualties. What was supposed to be a decisive breakthrough turned into a slaughter, with no real territorial gains made. The decision to engage in the Battle of the Somme highlighted the devastating consequences of outdated military tactics, poor planning, and an underestimation of the enemy's resolve. The pain wasn't just in the losses, it was in the pointless waste of life. The Battle of the Somme didn't just leave scars on the battlefield, it left a nation questioning the competence of its leaders and the price of war. Chapter 40: The Space Race and the Decision to Prioritize Moon Landings in the 1960s. At the height of the Cold War, the United States made the bold decision to prioritize landing a man on the moon. This decision, spurred by President Kennedy's challenge to land a man on the moon and return him safely to the Earth, became a symbol of American ingenuity and technological supremacy. However, what seemed like an inspiring challenge was also a gamble that came at a cost. The decision to focus so heavily on space exploration diverted resources and attention from domestic issues like poverty, education, and civil rights. The pursuit of a lunar landing, while a technological triumph, shifted the national focus in a way that some argue delayed progress in other vital areas. The U.S. successfully landed on the moon in 1969, but the consequences of this decision still linger. What seemed like a necessary victory in the space race became a symbol of both human achievement and missed opportunities. The space race was a race for supremacy, one that altered the course of history, but left questions about what could have been done with those resources. Chapter 41. The decision to drop the second atomic bomb on Nagasaki after the devastation of Hiroshima in August 1945, the United States made a controversial decision to drop a second atomic bomb on Nagasaki. While Hiroshima had shown the power of the bomb, many historians argue that dropping another bomb was unnecessary. Japan was already on the brink of surrender, but the decision to drop the bomb came from the desire to end the war swiftly and to demonstrate the United States' overwhelming power to the world. The second bombing caused immense devastation, and estimated 40,000 people were killed instantly, and tens of thousands more would die from radiation exposure in the years that followed. What began as an effort to bring peace swiftly ended up adding layers of suffering. The decision to drop the second bomb forever altered the world's perception of nuclear weapons, raising moral and ethical questions that persist to this day. It was a decision that saved lives in the short term, but left a legacy of destruction that can never be undone. Chapter 42. The failure to prevent the Rwandan genocide in 1994, a series of poor decisions led to one of the most horrific genocides in history. Tensions between the Hutu and Tutsi populations in Rwanda had been simmering for years. But when the assassination of Rwanda's president triggered the violence, the international community failed to intervene. Despite early warning signs and calls for action, global leaders and peacekeepers did little to stop the mass murder. Over the course of just 100 days, an estimated 800,000 people were killed. What began as a political assassination quickly escalated into systematic slaughter. The failure to act in the face of overwhelming evidence of the impending genocide left the country shattered, its people forever scarred. The decision to ignore the signs wasn't just a failure to act, it was a betrayal of humanity. The world watched in silence, and by the time the international community responded, the damage had already been done. Rwanda would never be the same again. Chapter 43. The ignoring of early warning signs before the Great Chicago Fire on October 8, 1871, a small fire broke out in a barn in Chicago. But the decision to ignore early warnings allowed the blaze to spread uncontrollably, destroying much of the city. The fire quickly swept through Chicago's wooden buildings, fueled by dry weather and strong winds, and devastated nearly 3.3 square miles. The city, which was rapidly growing, had ignored fire safety measures and failed to account for the risks of rapid urbanization. What began as a minor fire became a catastrophic event, killing over 300 people and leaving 100,000 homeless. The cost of the destruction was immeasurable, not just in terms of lives and property, but in the rebuilding of Chicago's reputation. The fire forced the city to rethink its urban planning and safety measures. What seemed like a small oversight turned into a turning point for urban development. The Great Chicago Fire reshaped the city and introduced new approaches to fire prevention and building codes. Chapter 44. The Space Race and the Decision to Prioritize Moon Landings in 1961, President John F. Kennedy's decision to prioritize landing a man on the moon was a pivotal moment in the space race. The goal was clear: outpace the Soviet Union and prove American supremacy in space. Yet, behind this lofty ambition lay the diversion of resources and focus from pressing social issues, such as poverty and civil rights, to an ambitious space program. The Apollo mission ultimately succeeded in 1969, with Neil Armstrong becoming the first man to walk on the moon. However, the cost of this achievement went beyond the $25 billion spent on the program. The decision to allocate vast resources to space exploration while domestic needs went unmet had long-term consequences. While the moon landing solidified America's space dominance, it also left questions about priorities and the true costs of human achievement. In the end, the decision to focus on lunar exploration was both a triumph and a symbol of missed opportunities. Chapter 45: The Oversight in Handling the Rise of the Taliban in Afghanistan in the 1990s. The U.S. and its allies made a critical mistake in their approach to Afghanistan. After aiding the Afghan Mujahideen in their fight against the Soviet Union, Western powers turned a blind eye to the rise of the Taliban. The decision to neglect the region, combined with limited international engagement, allowed a brutal regime to take root. The Taliban seized control of Afghanistan in 1996, imposing a regime that would shelter al-Qaeda and foster terrorism. The oversight was disastrous. The Taliban's rule led to widespread human rights violations, and their alliance with al-Qaeda would culminate in the September 11 attacks in 2001. By failing to address the threat early on, the U.S. and its allies inadvertently created a breeding ground for extremism. The decision to overlook the rise of the Taliban came with profound consequences. The aftermath continues to impact global politics and security, showing how one neglected issue can spiral into an international crisis. Final payoff: these 45 dumb decisions weren't just mistakes, they were the sparks that set the world on fire. From wars to genocides, from scientific discoveries to deadly oversights, every one of these moments proves the unpredictable power of human folly. Small decisions, made in moments of arrogance, ignorance, or haste, changed the course of history in ways no one could have imagined. What seemed like insignificant choices spiraled into disasters that reshaped nations, economies, and the lives of millions. The butterfly effect of stupidity shows us that no decision, however minor, exists in a vacuum. One careless choice can ripple outward, creating waves that affect generations. History wasn't just shaped by the wise, and the just, it was also molded by foolishness, and the world is forever different because of it. These decisions remind us that the smallest moments can have the biggest consequences, changing everything forever.